Well, we had, I think, a very useful discussion, a very good briefing from Mr. Lansus about the state of play with UNSMIS, UN monitoring mission in Syria. And I think the information he gave us, apparently relying on the observations of the monitors, was in many ways quite objective and gave, of course, a very tough presentation of the situation, but also was referring to things which have been done both by the government and by armed opposition groups. But to us, of course, the discussion of the future of the UN presence in Syria is quite important. You may have heard, repeated even today, statements by some members of the Council declaring that August 19 is going to be the last day of the UN monitoring mission. And Mr. Lansus's presentation gave us a number of examples of an important and useful role the mission is continuing to play despite all the difficulties which it has been encountering over the period of its activity. The question we asked is about the strategy which those members of the Council who advocate the termination of this mission have in mind. Because to us, the strategy behind the deployment of the mission is very clear. It is trying to provide objective information about the situation on the ground. It is trying to help establish political dialogue, and it is also doing humanitarian work. And again, as the Undersecretary General has described to us, some useful work is being done by this mission. It's not obvious at all what the strategy might be behind the call to terminate the mission. And there was no answer. I have not heard even an attempt to describe a strategy which might be behind this termination of the mission. Mr. Lansus did indicate that the Secretary General is going to be presenting his proposals for the future presence of United Nations on the ground in Syria, pointing out very rightly that the United Nations cannot abandon the people of Syria. We welcomed that prospect of the proposals by the Secretary General, but also indicated that it must be a role which would be more than symbolic. And we strongly urged the Secretary General to continue the military monitoring component. You may recall that Russia has volunteered 30 monitors to participate in that mission, because we do believe that objective information is important. We do believe that the contacts and practices and experience which have been accumulated by the mission over the past few months are important, and they should be preserved. So, you know, when we talk, as we do from time to time, about the need to have unity in the Security Council, we need to have clarity about the strategies. Our clarity in support of the strategy of continuation of the mission is clear. The answer to why there may be a need to terminate the mission has not been received. Well, you know, we've had also some exchanges, of course, about the news about the decision of Mr. Annan to resign, and some colleagues read some statements which apparently were made today, some of them sort of indicating that it may be, again, that veto which was cast by Russia and China, which may be to blame for Kofi Annan's departure. So I did need to point out, for instance, that when yesterday the Washington Post came up with an article which was harshly critical of Kofi Annan, I think if the United States were really in support of the special envoy, the spokesman of the State Department could have said a few things in defense of the special envoy. Also, I was quite shocked to learn, in response to my question, that in fact Mr. Gaino, the right hand of Mr. Annan, was recalled to Paris several days ago for some bureaucratic function, which apparently there was no one else to perform in the huge French bureaucracy. And Mr. Gaino, who has not worked in Paris for over a decade, is absolutely required his presence there right now, in a situation where he is the trusted right-hand man of a special envoy trying to deal with the most acute political crisis on the planet these days. So the thing is that we've had a situation where some countries, some members of the Council, over the months were expressing in words their support for Kofi Annan's activities, whereas their actions were completely different. And they were expressing in words their support for his plans and the direction of his activities, but in fact the strategy which they were actually pursuing was obscure, and that obscurity was manifested today in their inability to answer the questions about the strategy behind their intention to terminate UNSMIS.
To maintain a UN presence in Syria, does it absolutely require a new resolution on August 19th, or is there some way with DSS, Department of Safety and Security, or in some other way?
No, I think it does require the continuation of UNSMIS. It does require a resolution. And of course, the UNSMIS includes both military monitors and some civilian humanitarian activity. Both need to be continued.
Syria has been providing information to the Council, but the problem here that you are divided in the Council and you couldn't reach an agreement, especially in
no, but still, you know,
is not able to do its mandate. So what's the point of keeping them there?
You know, of course, I mean, one has to admit that the mandate as originally is envisaged could not be performed simply because the parties did not abide to the deal which was offered by Kofi Annan, and the use of force was not stopped. But again, when you take a decision, you need to understand what goal are you pursuing. The useful thing which has been described to us by Mr. Lansus and the useful contacts and experience which the mission has accumulated is there. And of course the objective information is very important. Some colleagues routinely ignore that objective information, which was even clear today when Mr. Lansus, for example, did say that obviously on the basis of the observations of the monitors that what they sometimes call the battle for Aleppo or of Aleppo was started by attacks on government positions, checkpoints, and other positions. But you know, some members of the council, they continue their routine of the past 15 months. You know, the government fighting against its population, using force against its population. This is just a propaganda line. It does not lead us anywhere, or does not lead anybody anywhere. Does not reflect the situation the way it has been over the past 15 months, and especially the way it is now. So and of course we are all concerned about the current situation in Aleppo and the prospects of violence increasing, but in order to deal with it politically and on the ground, one must have objective information. So in the absence of better explanation, my answer is that those who insist that the UNSMIS should be terminated, they do not want this objective information, and they have some other things in mind rather than stopping the violence and political accommodation.
There is, I mean, it has been said, I mean, in the morning, the French ambassador gave a press conference as the President of Security Council. He was very clear that they will not allow this mission to continue, that they will oppose it. Number one. Number two, I believe I'm hearing the Secretary General wants this mission to continue or propose another mission in Syria in order to keep the process going. So what is it that can't you reach some sort of compromise?
Well, you know, we are prepared. We understand that, you know, it was first the United States who said weeks ago that they don't want the mission to continue. Then some others picked up, you know, the choir, the French, the UK delegation. We are prepared to look at some, you know, compromise. And, you know, if there is a proposal for changing the name and, you know, somewhat changing the format, we wouldn't mind. But they shouldn't have put themselves into this kind of a corner, but we are prepared to try to help to find a way out. We do believe that all the components of the mission should continue if the Secretary General were to decide or to propose to change the name and maybe add some other functions or modify some of the functions to make it more effective, enlarge the number of monitors, you know, some other things. We could look at it, and most likely positively.
You've given strong support to Mr. Annan's plan, but before the Geneva meeting, he sent a letter to the P5 ministers specifically asking for sanctions under Chapter 7.
I'm not aware of such letter. I don't think so. I don't think so. Why? It's a hypothetical question about the past. About the future, it's impossible. About the past, it's even more impossible.
the chemical and biological weapons.
You know, one thing, incidentally, on the positive side, which I think we could hear from Mr. Lansous, he told us about the exchange of letters between the Secretary General, Mr. Ban, and Mr. Mualim, the Foreign Minister of Syria. In his letter, Mr. Ban, and I'm sure his spokesman would be able to do it more accurately, but anyway, he, of course, expressed his grave concern about some statements emanating out of Damascus on the subject of chemical weapons. And from what I heard from Mr. Lansous, the letter from Mr. Mualim was very reasonable, where Mr. Mualim did confirm that Syria is abiding by its obligations under the Geneva Protocol of 1925. This is exactly what Russia may have been the first to tell the Syrian government, reminding it that Syria ratified the protocol back in 1968, so it's international obligation that chemical or biological weapons cannot be used under any circumstances. We made similar demarches privately, and similar sort of statements were made, of course, in our capital. And I'm very pleased that this is now reflected in the letter of Mr. Mualim to the Secretary General of the United Nations. So I think that it's a good example where the international community took a clear stand, and that the Syrian government responded with understanding of its obligations. And I would not want, we would not want to see this theme to be used for further sort of whipping up the atmosphere around the Syrian crisis. It's tough enough. So I think the point has been made and taken, and this should be welcome. I don't. I don't know if he had this idea. I didn't hear him explain that in the Security Council, so I cannot respond.
Table a resolution for a new mission by the 19th.
I'm not prepared to say now what our strategy might be. Thank you very much.